Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this Saturday afternoon for Science Gallery Bengaluru's exhibition season Psyche. Science Gallery Bengaluru is a new institution for research-based engagement with the public. And Psyche is our fifth exhibition season, which is completely digital and online and explores the complexities of the human mind. Today, we are having our very first museum walkthrough as a part of Psyche. And as a part of that, I'm very pleased to welcome Bart Marius to show us the Museum Dr. Guislain as a part of his event titled The Museum Dr. Guislain from Asylum to Museum or Monument. A bit more about Bart. Bart has been working in the Dr. Guislain Museum since 2007, first as a project leader in scientific collaboration, later as a curator of numerous exhibitions in Ghent and abroad. Since 2019, he has served as the artistic director of the museum, where he combines his interests in both psychiatry and art history. Before we begin the session, I'd also like to tell you about the upcoming programs this weekend. Do check out our workshop, Reimagining Social Media Platforms via Experimenter Samyukta Prabhu tomorrow at 10 a.m. in the morning. And also do join us for a film discussion between German filmmaker Patrick Burr and psychologist Dane Isaacs about Patrick's short film From Over Here. This is tomorrow at 5 p.m. in the evening. I'd also like to remind you that there will be an interactive Q&A session at the end of the walkthrough. So do please add your questions in the Q&A box. And we'd also like you to share your thoughts with us about this event in our feedback form. You'll find the link in the chat box, so please do share your thoughts there with us. Now we'll get into the session. I'll hand over to you, Bart, to take us through the museum.
Hello and welcome. Thank you. I just have to start completely over again. Hello and welcome. I'm Bart Marius. I'm, as been told, artistic director of Museum Dr. Guislain, and I work here since 2007. I'm a trained clinical psychologist, and afterwards I studied art history. I have so a great interest in the history of art on one side and in the history of psychiatry on the other side. What the most important trigger is for me is to change the world a little bit so that it becomes possible to talk about mental health issues and about trauma, how small these traumas may look. Since I work for this museum, the museum itself and the international world of museums has changed. The importance that culture, history, and art has for the global society has become more and more an issue. A museum is not only the place where you can learn, it is also a place for immersive experience, and especially for us, a museum that tries to be a binding factor between collections, monuments, stakeholders, groups of visitors, and the neighborhood. That is why I needed to give you a more clearer insight in how our museum is embedded in the city of Ghent. But first things first, Museum Dr. Guislain, where does the name come from? Our museum opened its doors in '86, so not so long ago, actually. First, it started as a medical collection of psychiatric hospitals. There was an attic, and on that attic, some stuff that was found everywhere was on permanent show. This is where the attic was. The museum was in the first place intended for psychologists, for nurses, and other medical staff to gain insight in the history of psychiatry. Newspapers at the opening of the museum spoke of the Museum of Horrors. That says a lot about the collection and about the presentation. But it also gives a glimpse of how society, in a broader sense, looked at psychiatry back then. The reason why visitors were mainly medical staff is simple. Until the beginning of the 1980s, psychiatric hospitals were kind of small towns with a lot of permanent inhabitants. There were very big dormitories where people slept, sometimes with over 50 or 70 male inmates. But the situation where psychiatry came from seemed to be forgotten. We needed a lieu de mémoire, a place of remembrance. And this hospital had a mission for that. The picture you see here is a view of our main garden. I will come to that later. So we have a museum in an old asylum that wasn't a monument at that time, but still with a quite strange name, Dr. Guislain. This is the man. This is the reason why the museum is called Dr. Guislain. He was a professor at University of Ghent, and between Brex, Belgium, where I'm inhabitant of, didn't exist at the time Guislain became professor. We were united with Holland until 1830. Joseph Guislain came from a family of architects, so he had an enormous interest in buildings. And the first thing he became famous of was an idea of a big hospital for the mentally ill, the madmen, as they were spoken of back then. His design for this asylum won an important contest in Amsterdam, and Guislain, his idea of really building his dream started here. A few kilometers of the place where I am now is this statue of Guislain. He is shown, but you cannot really see it clear, as the liberator of the insane. When this statue was presented to the world, a lot of important figures of political Belgium, but also international guests were invited to Ghent. This was an important thing. A doctor of the incurable received a statue. Guislain worked hard to get his asylum erected. First, he needed support from the city of Ghent, but also from the university. And then he also needed a place where he could build the architectural masterpiece. This map of 1855 shows a small town compared to contemporary Indian standards. I think you cannot speak of a real city, but back then Ghent was the third city of the small monarchy Belgium, and it is still the third largest city of the country. What is clear on this map is that the medieval center, this is here with all the red buildings, that was still the biggest part of Ghent. And there are two very rare buildings, this one and the one on top. This first building is the first prison of the city. It was a large building that doesn't exist anymore, and it was in line with the method of Bantam. The central part, the round halls in the middle, are the places where the guards stayed. Because they are in the middle of a cylindric-shaped building, they had an overview over the prison cells that were in the arms of the building, of the cylinder. And the second strange building is on top of the map. You can see it here, and that's this building, only surrounded by a lot of growing fields and green space. This is where Guislain building is, the asylum for insane men. Yes, in the 19th century, male and female patients, they were separated. You can see that there aren't many houses around the hospital. Since this was the location near an important river complex of the city, a lot of rich bourgeois couples of Ghent came to have Sunday walks in this area. That is the reason why the institute is quite some meters from the water. The city major told Guislain that he could have his building, but in no case the yelling and the screaming sounds of the hospital could be heard at the places where these couples had their Sunday walks. Another thing that is obvious by this plan, the surrounding of green space, was of course also a therapeutical important tool. Close to nature would help to calm the minds of all these sick men. And it would be possible to have growing fields for the institute itself. That had to do with another demand of the city major. As you can see here on this rare picture of the front of the building, this photograph was discovered only a few years ago. There was a growing field around the entire building. On these fields, patients of the institute worked for their own survival. The vegetables they grew were the food these patients had. I will come to this later. This plan shows the Hospice Guislain, as it was called. In Ghent, the hospital is known by older inhabitants as Saint Guislain. But Guislain, he really wasn't a saint at all. He was never a real Catholic, we suppose, because you cannot see any religious building on this print. In the 1930s, the Brothers of Charity became the staff of this institute. And since they were a Catholic congregation, they needed a church to pray. That you will see later. What is also important here is the revolutionary architectural system Guislain used. The system of pavilions, These are pavilions, all connected to each other, and with always a central garden. The importance of rest seems obvious and is still today an important thing in building new hospitals. You also can notice that the entire building has a wall around it, and most of these walls were destroyed during the years. Only this part is the only existing wall today. The pavilions in the front, these pavilions are the buildings for the rich patients. Most of them stayed in another asylum more closely to the center of the city, but there were always rich people in this institute as well. And the biggest pavilions, this is where the museum is located now, these were for the working patients who worked in farms, etc. There was also a small pavilion for mentally disabled children and on top of the print. And this was not really psychiatry, but it showed how man-centered Guislain was. This group of children normally kept in houses, and the people, they were ashamed of this. Some of these children were kept hidden in closets and basements or attics. A very sad life for most of these children. How does the surroundings of an institute look like today? This is Ghent. This map shows Ghent as a city that's been growing since the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, and that the hospital itself has been surrounded by lots of working class houses you can see here. The neighborhood that was an important aspect for the institute as a small town living on its own is completely changed, as you can see. The neighborhood is still for working class mainly, and although the museum and the hospital are still on the same spot, the connection between people living around us is quite difficult. Psychiatry is still a scary thing, and being a museum inside a scary environment is not the most easy job. You may remember this figure I showed a few minutes ago. This is the situation at the start of the institute, and this is the situation today. The major building of the 19th century still exists, and most of these buildings are museum today. Just to make you clear, the museum and the hospital, they are two separated institutes. We discuss a lot, of course, and we're working together very much, but I don't work as a psychologist in the hospital, and neither of our staff of the museum has anything to do with the work of the medical staff of the hospital. A lot of patients that are treated come to visit our museum on a regular basis, some even daily. They are visitors in our museum bar. And what is the ideal place to go away from a therapy environment? And that is an inside hospital and museum more and more share. Having a museum that is open to the public must be a safe space or a haven for the patients, a place where you can mingle with the normal world and don't have to feel sick or ill. To end this presentation, before I'll take you on a walk through our museum, I just wanted to show you some photographs that were made in the Institute at the end of the 19th century. They give an insight in what a mental hospital was back then, with big dormitories where the beds are tightly cleaned up, a lot of light coming in through the windows, a big dining room on the ground floor, very strict and rational, with a large table in the middle and two smaller ones on the side. In the back of the picture, you can see a large sphere in glass, this one, that was called a witch ball. It was a folkloristic belief that there were witches and bad omens everywhere in the building. And when they looked in the ball, these witches or these omens, and they saw their own reflection, they would be afraid, they would scare from themselves and flee. Guislain was a man of science, and he didn't believe this, of course. But what is more important is that he knew and understood that these men that stayed in the hospital did have such beliefs. A picture of the patients that were responsible for washing the clothes. You see that all men are wearing the same. Everyone was equal, and every man had to do the work he was good in. Like making clothes in an atelier, the men are sitting on tables, cross-legged, a typical way of sitting for men that stitch and sew. And a garden for children, as I told earlier. Here they play a game. In the garden, you also see witch balls here on this side. You see a main part of the building was mostly, you see a main part of the building with mostly the dining and recreation rooms on the ground floor. and the dormitories or the sleeping halls on the first floor. And maybe you notice this building is quite high for only 2 floors and that there are a lot of windows. Well, on one side, you see that the green space for the building was important, but on the other side, a lot of light should fall in these big halls because light gives life. These men are sitting at a table near the forest pavilion of the complex, and you can see that the walls aren't as high as the ones I showed you before. This is because the pavilion was intended for the dangerous and the very loudly patients. Behind the walls you see here are only separated cells for these dangerous men. The pavilion was very far from the street and in the center of the entire site, so sounds couldn't reach the walking bourgeois, you remember. A brass band, one of the only organized recreations for the inmates, and a brother of charity is leading it. The brother of charity is standing right here, and you can see also children in the front rows next to the grown-ups. In the back, we discovered a couple of years ago a patient that is looking somewhere up in the sky. And after a close look, it seemed that behind this man, there is a brother of charity who is standing there, and he has his hands around the patient. And suddenly we discovered that the man was blind. So a blind man in a brass band, strange. And I will make it a bit stranger to end this short presentation because this is the Guislain army. Indeed, an army of inmates in a special military uniform. They are all having a gun in their hands. This army was for men that needed a lot of structure in their days. Men that were lazy. They were given a uniform and a gun, a wooden gun, of course, not one they could shoot with. And we haven't found a lot of examples of institutes where this was the case, but in Guislain they were. And when the statue of Guislain that I showed you earlier was inaugurated, this army was the honorary guard. So the army existed for more than 30 years, and unfortunately the guns and the uniforms were destroyed years before the museum opened its doors. So with this small introduction, I hope I gave you an idea of the entire complex and the institute. And now I will take you on a walk. I will change from my laptop to my iPad and I take you through our buildings. I will start where I am right now, a place that is the center of our work as museum, our library that exists over more than 100,000 volumes on psychiatry.
We'll just wait as Bart rejoins us to take us through the museum.
So, I hope you can see me now, or you can see the building where
Yes,
I am in.
We can see it.
So I'm just going to have a small walk through the library. This is a library on history of psychiatry. As you can see, we always have lots of donations of books because a lot of our museum, and I'm going to the first part of the collection. And this is as you can see here, this is our precious books. Books in history of psychiatry on the 19th century psychiatry. And I'm walking through part of our library. Why? Because this is also the starting point of the work we do. This library is all from this one guy, this Jacques Schotte. He was a psychoanalyst. Here we keep and we are trying to preserve all his letters. He was a close friend to a lot of important psychoanalysts. And I'm now going to the museum itself. Maybe I'll be quiet for a moment because I'm going through our working space. So it's more like a labyrinth and a maze that I'm walking through. And you see the places where I am now. These are all the old recreation rooms. This is a place where we have this is behind the walls of the museum, of course. And now I'm entering the start of the museum. This is the reception hall, where we have two exhibitions, Balayer on Imogen Stitworthy, as you can see, and a Belgian artist, Mariske Broekmeijer. Behind the windows is the main garden. I will end my presentation, or maybe I'll start my presentation of the building here, so you can have a clear view of the maps that I showed you earlier. This is the building where our museum is hosted in. On the other side, there on top, you can find our art collection. This is the main garden of the working patients. And there you have the chapel that was erected in the 1930s because there were Brothers of Charity. What is very curious about the building is the windows. As you can see in these windows, these are not in wood, but they are in metal. It's more like bars in a prison. So the patients, they could not destroy the glass and escape the institute. That was a therapeutical idea of Guislain. Also, you can see the walls, they have bricks in yellow and in light red. And the reason was that these colors, they had a calming effect on patients. There behind the green space you see there, that's the place where the loudly and the dangerous patients were kept. I'm going upstairs to the first floor where our collection on psychiatry is. We have to take the stairs because there you see the handle. I don't know the exact word in English, but these are very high. Also, that has reason. Patients, they could not escape. It's, as I'm walking through, you see, it's more like and I'm going to the first floor where enormously there were the dormitories of the patients, and that is where we start our tour on the history of psychiatry. This is our collection. We have a new title, Unhinged, and it's an exhibition in 5 parts. The first part is on body and mind, where we have a lot of books by Galen and Hippocrates, for example, also from our own collection. This is the man I was talking about, Joseph Guislain. And next to Guislain, there are 2 paintings. These paintings are typically for his romantic view on actually like the German psychiatrists. What we try to do in this exhibition is not really a chronological view on the history of psychiatry. You see even ethnographical work of art. You see reference to, for example, Goya or to shamanism. And in this part on body and mind, we are trying to think on what is the impact of the mind on the body and vice versa. For example, this skull is a reference to the phrenological treatment and theory in the 19th century. And the neuroanatomical part is also important here. This is a collection of a Belgian psychiatrist who did some neuroscience in the 1950s, but in a very amateuristic way. This fragment is a very interesting fragment because it's from a neurologist from Louvain. he made movies in the beginning of the 20th century. Movies of patients with neurological problems, but also psychiatric problems. Some of these small videos, they show hysterical phenomena, etc. And most of these are actually the oldest films we have in Belgium. They were discovered 20 years ago. The second part is on classification. What is important for us is the fact that in psychiatry, you have some very stereotypical ideas on patients. For example, here you see a woman with a wooden piece in her hands. That's the mother who thinks she has a child in her hand, or someone who is thinking of himself as the emperor, etc. Pictures we have from Bethlehem Museum of Mind. These are all part of the oldest pictures in psychiatry. And what is important in the part on the categorization or classification is the idea that in psychiatry people thought you could see it in the face, or you could see it in the way people behave when they were mad. But then we come to something that is important for our museum, that's contemporary art. These are works by Hans Eichelboom, and as you can see, he walked through, he visited a lot of cities in the entire world, in China, in Japan, in the US, in the UK, everywhere in Europe, and he made photographs of people. And then he started to diagnose or classify them again. So you have people with yellow jackets, or you have, for example, with a fur color, people with the same shopping bag. And it's his idea and his making fun actually of the fact that we people, we think it's important to classify other people just using the physical outside world. I'm going now to part of the third theme of the exhibition, that is on architecture. This is a very interesting scale model. It's a scale model made in wood, and it was made by a patient. It's very large, of an institute in Belgium. It's also a pavilion system, but the difference with Ghent is that it's all separated pavilions and not connected pavilions. These were all the scale model. The scale model is perfectly. So every window, every brick, it's completely how it should be. And at the end, there you have the farm of the institute, and even the scale is perfect. And in the middle, you have the church, of course, which was also very important. The only thing that is missing is that next to a church, you have the little small building that was for dissecting patients that died. And I think the patient himself who made this with one small knife, he didn't want to show this on his scale model. Another model we present here is the model of the prison I was talking you earlier, the Bentham system. This is a prison that is unfortunately completely destroyed, or it's not in use anymore. And we show parts of the Prinzhorn collection as well, next to our own ideas, or the ideas of Joseph Guislain, I mean, on architecture. The hall I'm walking now is the big dormitory. For us, important is the voice of patients. And there we have a podcast series. It's called Head Voice. And it's a podcast we made with people with severe addiction problems. But also the other small thing that is quite amazing is all these little letters. They were letters to God and to Jesus, very religious letters. They were found at the attic here in this building a couple of years ago, and they were hidden between pieces of wood. They're 100 years old or even older, we don't know. These letters are from a patient sent to a doctor. It's also very curious because, yeah, you cannot see it quite well, but it has very, very small letters on it. And I'm standing in a small place, and this place actually was the room where the Brother of Charity slept. He lived here. You can see it behind the wall there. You see a window, so he could control the entire dormitory on the other side of the wall. And this is, now you can not really see it, but it's a very big hall. These are, yeah, it's a part of the old building as well. These are parts of the installation for running clear water. That was very revolutionary in the 19th century, and Guislain was the first to add it in a hospital. This part of the exhibition is on imagination. So we had Roger Bell, the photographer of South Africa, on a visit, and he made pictures in South Africa of people who lived in outside society in very curious environments, very filthy. And there he discovered the art brut, or the idea of patients making work. And he lived there in these difficult environment with these people with mental problems. I'll give you a quick overview on our collection that is connected to art. In the back you see, for example, guns made by an outsider artist, but also you see a big painting by an painter from Ghent who died several years ago, or works by, this is Ronnie Dalru. You cannot see it quite clear. Ronnie Dalru is a contemporary artist from Ghent who worked for several months with an inmate in Geel. It's also a city in Belgium. This is a work by Adolf Wulfli, and I will come back to that in my lecture later today. I'm walking through the dormitory again to give you an idea also of other contemporary works. What we try to do in our permanent collection is to change a lot so that people can, they can come back to the museum, and it's not because they have seen the permanent collection that it always stays the same. So every 3 months we make a complete makeover of our collection. These paintings, these drawings, they are made in 1950s in a psychiatric hospital in Holland. They are by Klaas Koopmans, who had a nervous breakdown in the 1950s and stayed the rest of his life in psychiatric hospitals. This scale model is also interesting because it's a model of a tower that really exists in Belgium. It's the tower of Eben Azer. And the idea of the tower is by a man named Garcet. And you see the 4 beasts on top of the tower. He made it all by hand with stones he found in the neighborhood, and with a lot of friends, thinkers, philosophers, and artists. You still can visit it because it gives an idea of Garcet, his idea on how the human kind was evolving. Because in the back you don't see it really clear, but this is the starting point for the tour in his tower, where everything starts of the human evolution. These changed. They were used in the Gerard de Duivelsteen. That was the first, not really an asylum, but it was the dungeons of an old building, medieval building in Ghent, where patients were locked up. And you can see you have shackles for the entire body. Of course, there In the back, you see that's the link we make between the 19th century and in the 20th century, and how to take people there, make sure they don't have any power over themselves anymore. This is all about the voice of the patient. For example, this is a work by Drenthe. We received it a couple of years ago, all in boxes, all about his life in psychiatry. You see the pharmaceuticals, you also see the restrictional therapy, and also important in this part, of course, is the anti-psychiatric movement. This is all about that. I won't go in detail because it will lead me too far. But these are, I'm now standing in small parts of the building that were where Brothers of Charity lived. This is the last part of our permanent collection, and this is recovery pathways. This is also a project of photographies that were made by people, women with addiction in a big trajectory and a big project with University of Ghent and the High School of Ghent. They work together on life experiences. All these pictures, they are part of this. I'm now going back. I don't know if I have a couple of minutes. I cannot see my...
You do have some time. No worries. You can hear me.
Yeah. And how long do I still have? Like 10 minutes or so?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. You can go ahead.
Okay. Because I wanted to show you a part of our art collection. There's also a collection of, or a presentation of a contemporary artist, but unfortunately I cannot go in there because it's a non-performance, so you have to follow an entire trajectory through the exhibition. The only thing I can show you here is a series made by a young photographer in the dungeons of the Gerard Duivelsteen. These are parts of this dungeon. This is the place where psychiatric patients were kept in the beginning of the 19th century. And I will now have to go to the other side of the building. Taking the stairs again. Normally we have on this floor a lot of temporary to Belgians. We are seen as a middle or even a big museum. Creation also made by a young artist. It's something children can play on, but actually it's not used. It's not intended for that. And I'm going now upstairs to our art collection. And the collection we have here, it's not the art of contemporary artists, but it's art made by people who are not mainstream. Some of them, they are lived in psychiatry, others others are just people who are not really part of the mainstream art world, but making art anyway. For some people, this is a discovery because we have, it's not all our own collection. It's also a lot on show, like these trams and buses. They are made by Willem van Genk. He was an important outsider artist, or the city of this city was all in one person, is his house. Across the entire house, he had the idea that he felt he had to be an architect. It's only a very small part of what was kept. This is his idea of a utopia, of course. And utopia is something that comes back a lot, also in the work of Gerard van Langveld, also a Dutch artist, a mentally disabled man. He was a lot mocked by people in his town, and all the things you see, they work. For example, here he made a gun, a very strange gun, but a very detailed and a beautiful gun. And this works also. The train I showed you earlier, it's steam. It's on steam, and it also works. This is more like a religious environment, because it's the paintings of Glastra, an artist who, and I can show you here. This is not in textile or anything. This is all oil paint, but it's very thick, and it's more like a sculpture than it is painted. This is the entire art collection. I will not go in. I will just show you two more things. This is a collection of a man who collected in his house everything of the Second World War, everything of the period 1939, 45. And this painting is a painting that stopped him and meant his and was the start of his mental breakdown. You see, it's white. It's completely white. On the right, you see he started something, but that made him break down. The works of Tim Brown, Afro-American, who is telling his life story in a very, sometimes it's poetically, sometimes it's very hard, very rude. And here we have two environments in our museum, and this is some environment from Gandhihar in India. It's a part of the garden over there. Of course, it's a much bigger garden. Here we only have a few statues that show the idea of the maker of this. And this is an installation we can never change again. It's one hall that is full of things and of eyes and small heads. It's made by Langner. And every year he comes back and he adds a face. So now there are 2022 faces in the installation, and more are to come. This is a very difficult installation to preserve. It's a very, it's an environment you can be here for hours and look at things in this only. And this is this gave you an idea of our art collection. And you see, as you can see, it's not really the art that you expect in a museum of contemporary art, but it's art that gives an idea of the psychiatric patient who liberates himself and who is no longer a patient, but who can make work and just be an artist more than being a patient. So I think I will end the walkthrough, because maybe you hear I've been walking very fast. It's a very big building from one side to the other side. And now I'm heading for the library again, so I can do, if you have questions, I can try to answer the question.
Yes, that sounds good. Thank you, Bart. If the audience has any questions, please do add it in the Q&A box. while we wait for Bart to rejoin us from the restroom. Thank you, Bart. That was a really, it was really fun, the walkthrough, and we got to get a sense of the entire space, how large and expansive the museum is, the various kinds of collections and the exhibitions that you have. And I really want to come and visit in person. I think that's what I left with. But also, it's such an interesting space where you sort of feel the past come in collision with the present. And I think that's what feels particularly different about this as a museum compared to several others that we might have been to or experienced. So I think while we wait to see if the audience has some questions, maybe I can start with a few questions that I had while going to the exhibition with you. So I guess what I got a sense of was that the museum brings together contemporary art and historical objects, right? And as sort of the artistic director, can you tell me a bit about how you sort of combine these two to create an overall experience that still feels sort of cohesive and that talks to, I think, a lot of current concerns as well, right? And questions about around mental health, about psychiatry today. So what's your sort of approach towards bringing these two things together?
Yeah, first of all, I think that contemporary artists, they have the possibility to be in some kind of way also an outsider to historical aspects. So what I think is interesting, for example, we have a collection, you call it a herbarium, so with all flowers with medical powers of a psychiatrist, and then you have a contemporary artist who's working on that, and he makes something completely different, and he makes you look at a completely different way at these historical objects. That is mainly the reason why we use contemporary art, because an artist gave you the idea to, or give you the possibility to look at the history in a completely different way.
Next question. I mean, obviously, I guess that you seem to have a lot of artists who come and maybe in residence or who work with your collections and so on. But do you also have academicians or research scholars as well, maybe from historians, of course, but even from other disciplines who might be coming to do some kind of research at the institution?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because we don't really have an artist in residence program yet, but we're working on it, because we want to. You have a university museum here in Ghent, and we are collaborating to have a residence space where as artists as well as scientists can work, and maybe can work together as well, because we think that artists can influence a scientist and vice versa. On the other hand, I haven't been through the exhibition on Deligny because later in the lecture I will come to that, because there we have a quite classic exhibition with video work by Imogen Stitworthy. I mentioned it in the beginning. But we also have by Simon Ollemeers, who is a young scientist and an artist, and who is doing his PhD in the pedagogical science. And he's working together with children from the psychiatry here, youngsters from psychiatry, youngsters with mental health issues, and as well with the neighborhood. So we have a very interesting things happening, because he's an artist, Simon, but as well he's a scientist. So he's making his PhD, but from the viewpoint of an artist. So I think this mixed up and this mingling of art and science is very inspiring.
No, absolutely, I agree. I mean, that is something at the very core of what we do as well here at Science Gallery, right? It's all about bringing various disciplines together and getting various kinds of practitioners to be able to think together and sort of cross these boundaries that we've created between the disciplines. And exactly like you said, each can sort of open up new ideas, new ways of thinking for the others' practice. So, no, I think that's absolutely fascinating. And I guess, something else that sort of was very interesting for me is like how you spoke about the attic, where you found various kinds of objects and, which you have now become sort of part of the collection. And, it makes me wonder, right, how much of sort of your work with the collection is about preservation and, documentation of what already exists, and whether your experience with finding these objects in your own institution has also led you to sort of other similar hospitals or asylums, or in these cases psychiatric hospitals, whether to sort of push them to also similarly archive and document the histories of the institutions and the histories of the people who've been part of those institutions.
Yeah, indeed, we have some projects at the time running on that, but we've been working on it for 30 years since the beginning of the museum, because the previous director of the museum, the one who started the museum, she had to go to the garbage bags and to make the old medical registers not to be destroyed for entirely. So it's a young heritage. It's only since a very short period that people are interested in the importance of understanding the history of psychiatry. And we are still working on that. We have a lot of parts of other institutes, because some objects, there is the problem they can be destroyed, or of course the archives and the medical registers and so on, the medical files, they are in hospitals. But what we see, and the problem we think for the future, is that now everything is digital and a lot of the information is already lost. Like we in Belgium, we are far behind in the digital revolution, and we know for sure that the last 20 years a lot of information is lost, and it's a pity, because we try to make institutes aware that this is important also for future research. We try to show them research that is done on historical collections, just to show them how important it is to understand society and to make this historical research possible. And what is most dangerously is the art collections, because we have visited a lot of creative ateliers in psychiatric hospitals. I've seen ateliers from the 1960s. Belgium has and it's not to be so proud of, but Belgium is a very small country. But since the 1950s, we have creative independent ateliers. The history has never been written because we have a small country with 3 different languages and people don't understand each other, how strange it can be. And a lot of this atelier work is being destroyed. I've been to ateliers myself. I saw work from the 1960s, which was never shown to the public, really interesting pieces of art of real independent artists in psychiatry, and a lot of this work is destroyed. And now we are trying to make all these institutes aware not only of their heritage and their own medical history, but also of this artistic creativity. Because for me and for us as a museum, this creative idea or thinking about creativity is a way to liberate people with mental problems.
No, absolutely. I think that was most fascinating. And when you were actually showing us the works created by psychiatric patients across the years, I was reminded of yesterday evening's lecture where, there's Professor Joffrey, actually, he showed us several publications which were written by people who were as he calls them, ex-psychiatric patients, right? To be able to sort of take ownership of your story and to be able to be the author of it, or like in this case, the artist of your own creative expression, right? So I think that's really important, and as well as what you spoke about, incorporating their voices, their stories, whether through that podcast or through the historical material that you show. And I mean, another interesting sort of thought came to my mind while you were speaking, especially about archiving. And this is something that we encountered as well when we were trying to work with NIMHANS, which is the mental institution over here, mental hospital over here, which has its own archives. And it's this question of what is private and what is public, especially because in medicine there is so much importance and duly given to patient confidentiality and protecting the rights of the patient, which are critical. And then of course, as museums or galleries or as public spaces, we want to take material from these archives and then make it public, which often could then come in conflict with protecting patients' rights, right? For example, especially when you start talking about things like case notes or sometimes even maybe some of these photographs. So I'm just wondering how do you navigate this this area or this issue?
Yeah, it's that's a very difficult issue, of course, and privacy is of patients is the most important thing we have. So you have a rule of 75 years. After the death of a patient, you cannot then you can just start to use the information, like the historical research. We don't do it ourselves because we're a museum. So it's University of Ghent who is operating on the historical research. But like for pictures, we never show pictures from the patients in the medical registers. That's completely under laws of confidentially. Excuse me, I'm getting tired. Sorry. It's really it's not open to public. But of course we have group pictures. That's the things we showed, or I showed in my presentation, and these we show because these pictures are over 130 years old. So and we cannot discover anymore who these people were. So that's indeed it's a difficult issue because we have audio tapes from the 1950s, interesting interviews, but now for the moment we cannot present this to the public. It's too difficult. Although it gives an insight in how psychiatry worked, in how what psychosis was seen in the 1950s. So it's a thing we do research on, but you have to you have to work together with artists to find ways to make not only the preservation but also the presentation to a public and open it up for public debate possible.
No, I completely understand. And I think it's really great that there are very clear guidelines institutionally that protect both the rights of the individuals and, of course, allow for in the future for us to be able to use these things and still continue to have research as well. So I think that's really great. And I think this is a good point for us to maybe bring this session to a close and meet you again later in the evening for the lecture, where I think we'll dive deeper into the exhibitions and into some of the material at the museum. So thank you so much, Bart, for this walkthrough of the museum. It was really fascinating. It was quite fun, and it was such a different space for us to be able to explore. So thank you for the privilege. And before we wrap the session, I'd like to remind all our visitors and those who are watching on YouTube that the recording of the event will be available on YouTube. So you can always come back and see it in case you missed the live session. You can also join us again at 6:30 for Bart's lecture titled Towards a Museum in Psychiatry. So where Bart will be talking more in detail about his work, about the particular collections. And you can also explore the exhibit, The Asylum, which is in the Psyche exhibition. This is by Alok Sarin, Pratima Murthy, and Sandeep Jain, which looks at the history of mental hospitals in India from pre-colonial times. So I'm sure you'll find some interesting parallels between what Bart has shown us and what Bart is speaking about today in that exhibit. You can also check out the book in our media lounge, Unhinged, on Jitterbugs, Melancholics, and Mad Doctors, which was co-authored by Bart, and which again talks about some of the fascinating work and collection of the Museum Dr. Guislain. We would like you to please do fill up our feedback form and tell us a bit about how you enjoyed this program and what else you would like to see in terms of programming from Science Gallery. And do sign up for the rest of our programs in the next 2 weeks. The exhibition closes soon on the 15th of May. So do see it before that. Thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you in the next event. Thank you so much, Bart, for being here.
Bye.